Right, now looking at the numbers of Menta. So we have the financial statements for the last 2 years. That's the year ending 31st December 2017 and 31st December 2016. So since Menta is a very large company, the financial statements are presented in millions. Looking at the revenue, we see that the revenue has increased between the 2 years. So if you are looking at a percentage, this is roughly around 5% increase in revenue. Whereas cost of sales, although it has increased, it has simply increased by a very small proportion. So say 0.4% increase. So revenue has increased by 5%, cost of sales or operating cost rather has increased by 0.4%. So we see that operating cost control has been exerted properly, and as a result of this we see the operating profit has increased. Now looking at some ratios, if you look at the operating profit margin, you see that it has increased from 32% to 35%, simply because the increase in sales as a percentage was much significant compared to the increase in operating cost. Then we see there's a drop in the finance cost, possibly because we have repaid some of our borrowings, right? So when we look at the SOFP, we would understand that fact. So profit before tax again has increased, simply due to the increase in operating profit and reduction in finance cost. Then taxation, tax has slightly increased, naturally due to the higher profit. So looking at the net profit margin, we see that it has increased from 23.6% to 26.9%. So that's a healthy increase from within 1 year. Now we also see a additional figure, which is the gain taken to the translation reserve. So this is generally for foreign exchange translations, possibly because they have foreign subsidiaries. And when it comes to foreign subsidiaries, we know that there's a adjustment for net assets and goodwill, right? Foreign exchange or foreign currency adjustment rather. Looking at the SOFP, goodwill has increased. So we know that goodwill cannot be revalued upwards. So the only reason for goodwill to increase is possibly because we have purchased subsidiaries. Property, plant and equipment has also increased by a significant amount. So if you are looking at a percentage, it's roughly around 45% increase. So seems like they have opened up new routes, and also when you open up new routes, you'll have to invest in more vehicles. And even for existing routes, sometimes you might replace the existing buses. And as we remember, Menta also invests in other assets like airports and other facilities, types of assets that complement their business. Inventories, well, not a significant amount, and it shows us very slight increase, nothing much to be worried about. Trade receivables have slightly dropped. Now these trade receivables probably include possibly government payments, government subsidies, because government would be a powerful party and they can generally negotiate for a certain credit period. Now we know that the government has offered, or government offers subsidies for routes where the amount of people are less, and also they give a certain reimbursement for tickets on behalf of elderly and disabled people. And apart from that, even the school boards, on behalf of school transport, they might take some sort of a credit period from Menta, and Menta would be more than willing to offer it because there are other competitors bidding for it. So the credit period might also play a role in the tender being chosen. Cash and cash equivalents, well, quite a significant balance, 327 million, although it has slightly reduced from last year. So possibly our directors are holding some cash for some future investments. Maybe they have some plans in 2018 and they might be saving up some cash for that, or it may even be because this is a general policy, right? There are some companies that hold an extra amount of cash, so generally risk averse, right? So the overall asset base has increased. Share capital and share premium, well, it has increased possibly because we have gone for a fresh issue of shares. Retained earnings have increased due to the profit. Loans, long-term loans have slightly reduced, or actually not slightly, it's by a considerable amount. So if you're looking at an amount, it's around 171 million repayment. Now the increase in property, plant and equipment has been financed partly through the shares and also through retained profit possibly. When I say retained profit, please remember that I'm referring to cash and cash equivalents, because retained earnings are not a actual cash item, right? So this is probably why our cash and cash equivalents, the balance has it's almost the same as last year or slight reduction, possibly because the money we earn from our operating activities, we have invested a large amount on property, plant and equipment. Then looking at trade payables figure, trade payables have slightly reduced. So trade payables might include our suppliers for certain items and also service providers like service stations and places that conduct repairs, etc. So that's our financial statement. And further to this, when we look at the reconciliation of the retained earnings, we see that there's a difference, which would be the dividends. So the approximate dividends that would have been paid, so we have an opening balance of retained earnings of 427.6 in 2016, and in 2017 we made a profit of 1133.7. that adds up to 1561.3. But the retained earnings closing balance is 942.8. So roughly we have paid 618.5 as a dividend, right? So that's a very healthy dividend, more than half of the profit for the year, right? It may be considered as a little too high even, right? So now looking at some additional information. So this is segmental information, operating segments. So since we are a listed company and the conditions under IFRS 8 seem to have been satisfied, we see that we have identified operating segments in two ways. One is geographically and the other one is by the type of service. So we are given the operating profit and the revenue for each of these segments. So looking at Centralia, the revenue has increased slightly from 16 to 17. Rest of Eurozone, it has dropped. North and Central America, it has increased. Asia also, it has increased. Looking at the profit figure, Centralia, it has increased. Rest of Eurozone, slight drop. America, also there's a significant drop, whereas Asia, there's a significant increase. Now, looking at the comparative figures as percentages, so the operating profit margin, Centralia has increased, which is a very good sign because it's the dominant country that we are operating in. Rest of Eurozone, there's a slight drop, and this is somewhat concerning. North and Central America, there is a huge drop from 66.68% to 26.26%. Now in the first place, achieving almost a 67% profit margin is a great achievement, but why did it drop by such a big amount is a little bit of a question. So probably because we are facing a lot of competition in America. That is one possible reason. But if you look at Asia, in 2016 it was very less profitable, but in 2017 it has managed to achieve a profit margin much higher compared to the other geographical segments, right? So we saw that we know that the Asian economies are picking up, right? So with that in mind, it would be a good move for Menta to penetrate more into the Asian region, right? Then looking at the type of service, intercity revenue has increased. City also the revenue has increased, whereas rural it has slightly dropped. And looking at profits, there's an increase, and there's a drop respectively. Looking at the margins, intercity it's almost the same as last year. City there's a higher margin, so possibly because the number of passengers have increased. We know that the operating cost, around 70% of the operating cost vary with the distance travel, and higher the passenger numbers, higher the contribution as well as the profit margin, the percentage. Rural it has slightly reduced, so we know that rural routes are not very profitable, and this is why governments are providing subsidies. So possibly the government subsidies has slightly reduced comparatively, and this may be why we are facing a lower profitability in 2017. Right, so that's about Menta's financial statements. Now we have our main competitors' financial statements, and I have also looked at the ratio analysis. So, okay, just one point that I need to make. If you look at Centralia revenue made by Menta, it's 2.9 billion. Now on page 11 we saw that, okay, let me take you back to page 11 quickly. Page 11 mentioned that Menta has a 30% share of the market in its home country by revenue. So coming back to the financial statement, 2.9 billion, that accounts to 30% of the market. So the total market size is roughly 9.7 billion, right? That is 2910.3 divided by 0.3, which is of course 30%. So the total market size is roughly 9.7 billion. Now looking at Dollbus's financial statements, we see that their revenue is 3.459 billion. So 3.459 billion as a percentage of 9701, that's 9.7 billion. So Dollbus has a market share of roughly around 35.7%. So Menta has a market share of around 30%, Dollbus roughly around 35.7%. Right, so let's analyze the statements of Dollbus. So this is the largest transport provider in Centralia, and they operate only within Centralia. Now there is also the possibility of them looking at international markets just like us, and they might even enter into markets that we are currently operating in outside Centralia. That's also a possibility that you can expect. So Dollbus's revenue, we see there is an increase. If you are looking at a percentage, we are looking at roughly around 3%. Whereas operating cost has reduced. Operating cost, there's a slight reduction. So we saw the same thing in our company. There was a very small percentage increase in operating cost, and there was a overall increase in the operating profit margin. So looking at their operating profit margin, it's 31.2% as opposed to 29%. Now note the fact that we have a higher operating profit than them in absolute sense, and that's possibly because our statements consist of revenue and profits from countries outside Centralia as well, but Dollbus is purely looking at Centralia. So if you want to make a accurate comparison, we can compare our Centralia performance, right? So Centralia, we have made an operating profit margin of 36.52%, whereas Dollbus has made 31.2%. So that would be an accurate comparison. So our profit margin in Centralia itself is higher than Dolbus, as we see. Dolbus finance cost has also slightly reduced, again possibly due to the repayment of debt. Then profit before tax has increased, taxation has slightly increased due to the higher profit. Looking at the SOFP, goodwill seems to be the same, possibly because they haven't acquired any new companies. Property, plant and equipment has increased, but not by a very large amount compared to Menta. Inventory is almost the same and at a low level. Trade receivables slight drop. Cash and cash equivalents 2.5 billion in hand. Share capital, no new shares issued. Retained earnings is due to profit. Now if you are looking at the dividends, possible dividends, so opening balance is 624.8 and the profit for the year is 842.5. Closing balance is 920.7. So we have a roughly a dividend of around 546. So somewhat close to the amount that we paid, which was 618, something like that. Loans have slightly reduced. Current liabilities, trade payables have slightly reduced. So the financial statements, the comparison figures look very much similar to Menta statements. And looking at some ratios of the two companies, now I need to mention that payable days and receivable days are generally calculated based on cost of sales, but in our case we had to calculate it using operating costs, so these are just for illustrative purposes. So return on capital employed, our ROCE has slightly reduced, possibly since our profit was higher than the dividends and also we had issued some new shares, whereas Dolbus it's almost the same with a very slight increase. Return on assets, a slight drop, possibly because we have purchased more assets comparatively, and this would of course not give a return immediately, right? When we purchase non-current assets, it might give a return, year by year over the medium term. So we need not worry too much about this drop. Dolbus, it has increased possibly because they haven't invested in assets compared to us. Return on equity, there's a drop because retained earnings and share capital, share premium has increased. And Dolbus also we see a slight drop. Now current ratio and acid test ratio seems like it's the industry norm because both companies have very similar figures. Receivable days also similar, payable days also look similar. Inventory days, well, it's a very small amount because if anything the inventory might be the material used for repairs and cleaning and things like that, maybe in the maintenance depot. Asset turnover, our asset turnover has slightly dropped once again due to the possible increase in assets, and in future we can expect the asset turnover to possibly increase. Gearing ratio, both companies it has dropped. Now Menta had a 49% gearing ratio, which is almost close to being highly geared, but now it's 33%, right? So the 50% threshold will be from the debt over debt plus equity. So it has more than halved from last year to this year. And same thing with Dolbus, gearing has dropped. So in case of Menta, this is due to our share capital and retained earnings increasing as well as non-current liabilities dropping. In the case of Dolbus, retained earnings increasing, and here too the non-current liabilities have dropped. Interest cover has increased. So naturally when you pay back your debts, the amount of interest you have to pay will reduce, and that would increase the interest cover ratio. So these are the reasons for the ratios that we see, and we have got a good idea about the performance of the two companies by now. So moving back to the pre-scene, we have 4 articles given from the press coverage. So let me quickly run through these. So first one is about the school bus accident. So the reason for this seems to be because there were no seat belts available on the bus, and also certain students were they were not seated at the time, resulting in a number of injuries. Now, this is a significant event, especially due to the fact that it involves school students, right? As I mentioned in the previous video, it's very important for the driver to assure higher safety in a school bus. Now, a spokesperson for Menta has mentioned that there is no regulation to require that buses should be fitted with seat belts, and the buses operate just with one driver and there's no one else available to supervise the children. Now, the incident is not exactly due to the supervision, but it's due to some external event, because there's a collision between a school bus and a lorry. So we don't know whose fault this was. A police spokesman confirmed that law states seatbelts should be worn if they are available. And the bus that was involved was 22 years old and had no seatbelts fitted. The Centralia Daily News contacted more than 20 local bus companies across the country, and none of them have seat belts in their buses. Right, so now that it has come to the media attention, Menta should make sure that it takes action to prevent such news being spreading in the future. So maybe a good idea might be to fit seat belts for every school bus, right? So because it would also give us some sort of a competitive advantage, because more than 20 local bus companies have or don't have seat belts fixed. And Menta is not exactly a poor company. They have a lot of money, and fitting seat belts may not be a very significant cost, or it will at least be a long-term value-adding expense. So they can look at the possibility of fitting seat belts. Now, when you are looking at an investment appraisal, maybe it's not exactly generating a positive NPV, but then again it will reduce the reputational risk of Menta, because if you look at the school article, or the press article, we see that Menta's name is mentioned here because it's an accident involving one of Menta's buses. So one small change can go a long way, right? And also, of course, they need to advise the drivers to be more careful while driving. Then the next article talks about local bus services declining due to intense competition between bus operators. It has forced many smaller businesses out of business. The remaining companies do not always find it cost effective, even if there are local government subsidies available. There is very little to be done to prevent this from occurring. So because all you need is a $50 fee to register a new route, and there have been cases of large companies moving into towns, running at a loss until the local competitors have gone out of business. Now, something we call predatory pricing. The deregulation of bus routes was intended to simplify the provision and encourage growth, but unfortunately, the demise of many independent bus operators has been an unintended consequence of this. Now, this is of course within the competitive scope of the industry. Right now, you cannot exactly call it unethical, because competition is something that is necessary. So large companies have the power to go temporarily at a loss until the other competitors move out and then increase the prices. So as I mentioned, it's called predatory pricing. Now there are certain opposing views on it, right? Some people argue that it might be unethical, but the others say, well, it's within the competitive scope and every company has to come up with strategies to survive and dominate the market. Now, one solution for this might be to bring in a minimum fee or minimum fare. Now, we see that in most industries that are being privatized, where the government plays a certain role by setting a minimum charge, for example, telecommunications for, let's say, data packages and mobile call plans and so on. There might be a minimum fee, just so that the smaller competitors are being safeguarded by preventing underpricing. So Centralia government can look into the possibility of doing that. Moving on to the next article, we see another similar incident, or this incident is connected to the underpricing problem. Jaria Buses ceases trading. So this company has served the local community for more than 30 years. That's because Menta moved in 6 months ago and started a local route and went to several of nearby large towns 6 times a day. Menta's fares were cheaper and they provided a very reliable service. Right now, no one can blame Menta for giving a more reliable service than Jaria buses, but if you are looking at the fares being cheaper, well, to a certain extent, it's arguable. Now, Jaria buses had to make 23 people redundant, or they lost their jobs rather. Now Menta has announced a 20% fare increase as they have no competition. So this is how the predatory pricing strategy works. Once all the competitors are out, now you are the dominant player and you can increase your fares. So here also the government can interfere and maybe announce or maybe set a fixed price, right? A fixed price for each travel route, or maybe at least a range. Okay, a minimum price and a maximum price. So minimum price is to safeguard the competitors. Maximum price is to make sure that passengers are not exploited. If say Menta or Dolbus is the only service operator in a particular area, right? Somewhat of a monopoly. Now Menta can look at the possibility of offering these 23 people jobs. So that way the pressure from the local community and other pressure groups, local government might also reduce, because local community will have a concern about the regional unemployment, right? So maybe Menta can look at giving these people the same jobs within the same routes, or maybe in routes close to their neighborhood, because Menta is a large company and currently they have more than 35,000 people, so offering 23 jobs may not be a major issue. And finally, environmentalists target Menta. Now we have read a lot of reports in the news and also through other sources about clean energy, right? And the fact that diesel is highly polluting the environment. Right now that global warming is taken very seriously, you find many countries around the world and many pressure groups making concerns about fuel such as petrol and diesel, and they are trying to get most of the companies and people to use clean energy sources, or clean fuel rather. Okay, a recent report highlighting the benefits of using electric trains instead of diesel buses is being blamed for environmentalists blockading the bus station and preventing Menta's buses from running. So we see that Centralia's electricity is mainly produced by wind turbines, which was of course more cleaner and safer than diesel. Many school children use the buses, and many of the buses are very old and efficient. So the bus that we looked at that was involved in the accident was around 22 years old, and that's a very long time, and also it didn't have seat belts and so on. The environmental group who organized yesterday's blockade intend to repeat it tomorrow. Now this is not so good on Menta, because this one blockade can multiply into many, and it might spread out to other countries as well, right? So this small attention that this is taking can go a long way. So maybe it's time for Menta to reconsider whether they need to, or they are continuing using diesel, or maybe whether they are going to switch to say electric buses. Now switching to electric buses would be a significant investment, because they'll have to dispose of the diesel buses. So that would be an investment appraisal decision where you might have to support or where you might have to give your opinion on how the calculations are to be conducted and interpret the results, right? Now, we know that many countries all over the world, they are going to cease the production of uh, vehicles running with petrol and diesel and instead switching to electric vehicles. So maybe Menta can be proactive and start a small transformation initially and then phase it out to the other areas. Okay, so they can maybe start selling their existing buses while the market is still accepting, because once government brings in strict rules and regulations, they may not be able to dispose the existing fleet of buses. So it's important for Menta to get as much information as possible regarding the future developments and act upon it as soon as possible, right? So this seems to be a very interesting industry, a very interesting company, and there are so many different areas that we can link to the pre-scene. Now, something I would like you to do would be to think of different scenarios that you can be tested on, right? So after we read the pre-scene, there might have been questions that appeared into our head. Okay, this can be tested, this topic might appear in a question, and so on. So please make sure you write those areas down, and maybe you can create your own short questions and you can do your own answers for these, because remember, your exam will be based on this company, right, relevant to this company in a particular scenario. So from the pre-scene, there are certain scenarios that we can build up, certain scenarios we can expect. One example is the fact that they might invest in electric buses, right? So like that, there are so many scenarios that we looked at throughout the course of these videos. So I would advise you to write these areas down and practice questions relevant to these. Now it's very important for you to practice mock exams connected to Menta. So if you visit our website, you can find out study packages, and we have 5 mock exams which are produced specially for Menta, which you can practice in our online platform, right? And you also have the option of receiving tutor feedback for your mock exams. And once more, let me remind you, do not skip any area from the 3 subjects, E2, P2 and F2, because you'll never know what area can be tested, and your examiner has made it very clear that the entire P2, F2 and E2 syllabus scope can be tested, right? So with that, I wish you all the very best for your management case study exam. So I hope you will qualify to be a financial manager and move on to the next level, the strategic level. Good luck.